Ovince Saint Preux didn't blink at the change of opponent he faced on just over a week's notice, and it showed with his performance against Yushin Okami in the main event of UFC Fight Night in Japan on Friday. It was quite the finish from Saint Preux, who outgrappled a noted wrestler in Okami after the fight hit the mat in the early part of the opening round. Once Okami made an ill-advised attempt to go for a guillotine choke on the ground, Saint Preux saw the opening for his favorite submission. Related watched highlights of Gakinsaki deputy splashed onto Okami's arm and pressed his shoulder down into the neck, setting up the rarely seen Von Flue choke before putting away the former middleweight title challenger in the opening round. Incredibly, for as rare as the Von Flue choke is inside the octagon, that was the third time Saint Preux has earned a win with that particular submission. Of course, because Saint Preux was facing a late replacement, it's no wonder he was a huge favorite going into the card according to fantasy players, with an overwhelming 87% picking him to win over Okami, although 80% did predict a finish by knockout, so the submission was still a bit of a surprise. In the co-main event, Jessica Andrade put on the best performance of her UFC career as she punished former title contender Claudia Gadelha over 3 rounds to earn a unanimous decision win. Andrade was one fight removed from facing strawweight queen Joanna Jędrzejczyk, but she looked better than ever as she dismantled Gadelha on the ground to get the win. Despite her credentials going into the fight, Andrade was a massive underdog with only 15% of fantasy players picking her to beat Gadelha on Friday night. It was quite the showing for Andrade, who sent a strong statement to the rest of the division with her victory. Dong Hyun Kim needed less than a round to put away former Pride champion Takanori Gomi in a lightweight matchup, where 68% of fantasy players predicted his win on the card. Meanwhile, former kickboxing superstar Gakinsaki earned a Performance of the Night bonus for his jaw-dropping on-a-pinch knockout over Enrique da Silva in a light heavyweight matchup on the main card. While his kickboxing credentials were well known, Saki was only selected by 38% of fantasy players, but his win also earned an extra 40 points because it was his UFC debut. Teruto Ishihara survived a back-and-forth battle with Rolando Dai to earn a win in his fight after 86% of fantasy players picked him going into the card. Top 10 ranked flyweight Jussier Formiga also made short work of Ulka Sasaki with a first-round rear naked choke finish with 74% of fantasy players selecting him in the opening bout of the main card. On the prelims, Keita Nakamura pulled off the upset with his split decision win over Alex Morono after just 36% of fantasy players selected him on the card. The same could be said for Sayuri Kondo, who got a split decision victory over Chen Mijin in a women's strawweight fight with just 40% of fantasy players picking her. Kondo also earned a whopping 160-point bonus for those players picking her, because it was such a tight matchup, and also because it was her UFC debut. Shinsho Ansai was also another impressive bonus fighter on Friday night as he pulled off a victory over Luke Jumo by decision with 51% of fantasy players picking him, but also delivering an extra 175 points because he was an underdog according to the odds makers going into the card. Daichi Abe closed out the card with yet another upset as he earned a decision win over Hyun Jae Lim with just 24% of fantasy players picking him. At the end of the night, the card was split, with 5 favorites getting wins and 5 underdogs pulling off the upsets according to the fight selections made by fantasy players for UFC Fight Night Saint Preux vs Okami.